been studying this book of late, and we are now into chapter 4. We have been tackling one chapter at a time, and as Max has just read to us, we have a number of topics that are in this chapter. The chapter itself begins to show somewhat of the pattern of this book. Some commentators, when they outline this book, one that I'm aware of says that there is no outline. That pretty much, I don't have a clue what to do with this book. You're just going to have to read it and figure it out. That as the writer of Ecclesiastes puts things together, it sometimes feels as if he's got thoughts that are not necessarily related, but they're put together beside each other in the text. And sometimes it feels a little bit of hodgepodge and patching and things together, and somehow they're all part of a bigger picture. And something of that is what we begin to see within this text. It is traditionally said to be written by Solomon, claimed to be the words of Solomon at any rate. And certainly he is known for the book of Proverbs. And there are many proverbs and wise ideas. And when we come to wisdom literature, sometimes it doesn't all just flow, as we're about to see. So quick recap for those of you who haven't been here. Just a really quick run through to understand what the book is about. Chapter 1 has reminded us how limited we are. All streams flow to the sea is never full. We're never really accomplishing anything. Our lives are always in the same place, generation after generation after generation. In my illustration, you could use a fishbowl, if you will, or even a snow globe, that we are living within the confines of what is here. And all that we know in our lives can be found from what is here, and something is missing. And if we look at life under the sun, which is a key phrase to the book, under the sun is a phrase that means let's just look at life without anything beyond us. Just consider ourselves and nothing of God. What would life look like under the sun? Well, all that we would have to find pleasure in are the things that are here, and to find meaning in are the things that we see. So chapter 2, he heads into a pleasure test, and he bought himself houses, many houses. And he had palatial houses, and he built gardens and parks and had fruit trees in them. And he had pools to water groves. And he had male and female slaves who were born in his house. He had more herds and flocks than anyone who was in Jerusalem before him. He amassed silver and gold for himself, the treasures of kings and provinces, you remember the text says. This man tried everything under the sun, everything that this world offered him. At the end of it all he could gather, the biggest conclusion, the wisest conclusion was, it means nothing. Ultimately, the earth will come to its end. This has some relative meaning, sort of has a tendency to give us that sense that we're actually accomplished something, but only in a temporary sense, not in an ultimate sense. It's only relative to you, but in the ultimate sense of meaning, there is none. It cannot be found. And so we are lost and caught in a universe of cycles of changes and things that come along that seem haphazard, that seem to be just events one after another in our lives. So he steps back and says that life under heaven is a series of seasons. And we are to look at these seasons as times to remember us that God's actually the one in control. There's a time to be born and a time to die. Without going through the list, you understand that these seasons bring all kinds of changes to us. I understand from what we're talking about now in the news that we're heading for a recession, or we're in recession, and that's the debate. Tell me, anybody in this room have anything to do with that? Can you control that? Can you stop that? Can you stop your funds from drying up, or your financial investments from changing, or whatever the case? It's out of your control. And that's the point of chapter 3, reminding us that all of these times and seasons are coming upon us, and there's always this flux of everything that's happening, and we're not in charge. You might think you're in charge, you might feel you're in charge, but in a sense it almost feels arbitrary. And the whole earth itself seems to somehow be out of our grasp. You ever notice how when there's a great earthquake or some sort of a cataclysmic event, people's hearts turn to God? That's the point of them. The scriptures say, as we're about to see, that these things are done so that men would fear him. So all of these events in our lives, some sad events, some happy events, some great events, some things that we're cheery about, all the rest up and down, all the scale of all that's in there, all the emotion. All of these events are there. Why? I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. There's an ultimate plan. These look like random, haphazard things. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. God has done it. all of this flux and flow of keeping our lives on the edge. You never know when your last breath will be. We all think we're in charge, but we all know on some level anything can happen. Why? So that men will fear God. Men will fear God, so that we will come to a place of, in ourselves, realizing we're actually not in charge. And our lives are meant to bring us to a place of submission, surrender. It certainly doesn't happen. In fact, you know that he said that he went into the place of justice and wickedness was there. He went to the place of righteousness and wickedness was there. And the wickedness of man pervades our society and our culture. So chapter 4 begins with another vanity thing that he sees, a vain thing he sees. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. I don't need to, I'm sure, explain the word oppression to you at any length. It is the idea of someone, typically someone who's under someone else's control. They are, person above you has the advantage. You are the small person on the totem pole, and they take that advantage and they turn the screws. I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. There's that phrase again, on earth, if you exclude God and take him out of the picture and remove any thought of there being a plan in any of this. Just look at all that is going on in the human race. When has there never been oppression? Even in our lifetime we have seen oppression. We knew of apartheid in South Africa, where there were people who believed that they were superior to another race, and so there was oppression. We saw that in the 20th century in Middle America, and all that was taking place between colors and races. There's always oppression. Remember, in my lifetime, I can remember what was termed the killing fields in Cambodia. Was one race rising up another race, and those who felt they were dominant, and we heard the same thing happening in Croatia. There's always oppression. I've seen all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And this is always what is going on in the human race under the sun. Behold the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of the oppressors there was power. There was no one to comfort them. He begins to see life as oppressive. Let me just give you one example. Maybe you heard this story, and I'm not going to go in length at this, but in 2012, I think it was in December, a young woman and her friend came out, I think it was a theater, and got into this bus. They were in Delhi, and they traveled in this bus for just a short period of time when 4 men attacked the man that this woman was with. When the man was subdued, they began to then attack this woman, and they raped her. And the bus continued on its journey for a full 31 kilometers while this attack took place. The woman ultimately succumbed to her wounds, and she died. The people who attacked her were arrested. They were put on trial. One of her attackers simply explained the situation like this. A decent girl won't roam around at 9 o'clock at night. A girl is far more responsible for rape than a boy. People had the right to teach them a lesson. I've seen all the oppression that is done under the sun, and the tears of the oppressed, and there is no one to comfort them. And you might say, well, that's just one case. Isn't that the situation in one person and a couple people? No, this is the culture. This is the lawyer who defended the attackers. And this is what he said. In our culture, there is no place for a woman. Girls should not be allowed to go out after a particular hour, like 9:30 or 10:30, and that with strangers. Incidents of rape are bound to happen if girls go out without proper security. It's her fault, clearly. And the society and the culture is built on this. I'm not trying to get political here. I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just simply stating a fact that the oppressions are always evident and always present within our world. And it is no wonder that he says, behold, the tears of the oppressed, they had no one to comfort them. Everybody is against them. The whole society works this way. We might not experience it all the time in our own personal level, but this is the state of the human race. This is what we've come to. That we are just turning on each other, we are against each other, we are saying, vying for position, who's morally superior to each other, who's mentally superior to each other. Even women are choosing that they are more superior to the fetus inside their own womb and eliminating that. We are always vying for position. Behold, the tears of the oppressed. What hope do they have? If you're on the bottom of the rung of the totem pole, there's no one to come to your rescue. No one can help you. Everybody is on the side of the person who has power. On the side of the oppressors, there was power. There was permission. There was no one to comfort them. Is it any wonder that he reaches the conclusion, I thought that the dead, it's a little overstated, but really, I thought that the dead who are already dead, more fortunate than the living who are still alive. It's better to be dead than to have to be facing the horrific Holocaust that another human being can place on you. But better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. So he takes us, his first thought is to the single-minded superiority of people who think they're better than other people. That's the common situation. Now, he notices his second observation. He brings us to another thought. It also has to do with being superior. And you'll notice now, what is our reaction to the fact that there are oppressions under the sun? Is it to pour ourselves into fixing the world? Is it to seeking justice and doing right? Again, then I saw all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and is striving after wind. There's also those who are trying to be superior, who are sitting on a jet plane, working in their office, even in the midst of travel, trying to get ahead, trying to get one more sale, trying to be one much better than the next guy beside them, just clamoring to get up and clamoring to be on top. Why? All skill, all toil, all work. It's a little overstated, but here's what he says. It comes from man's envy of his neighbor. This is the energy that turns the wheels of the world. It comes from envy, from a desire to get ahead. You know what that's like? You know what it's like to have one thing and want another? You know what it's like to be in that situation where you ordered a meal and your meal comes, and then the person you're with, their meal comes, and I should have ordered that. It's who we are. We are never satisfied with what we have. And there is a rat race that the human race feels inclined to get involved with. Who knows why? Who can explain where this came from? Who decided this is how it would have to be? But this is exactly who we are as a species. We are always trying to be one up to somebody else. That is why you have to have the car you have, because you wouldn't dare drive something you can afford, because you would look foolish in it, because you can't drive something you can afford. You have to have one better than that. You can't live in that neighborhood and be able to survive, and you've got to go right to the end. You've always got to. You're always thinking, what will other people think? How will I look? What will other people say? It is man's envy that drives us on. Why? Where does that come from? Striving and striving and striving. There is a word that comes to mind, a biblical word. When I read a text like this, it is simply contentment. Contentment. That is the call. And you can see the opposite side of this. He says in verse 5, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. So on the one hand, you have somebody who's clamoring to get to the top, making sure that they claw and they're better and they're bigger and louder and faster and make sure everybody sees it. They're always trying to beat out the Joneses. And then you have the opposite side of the pendulum, someone who gets in their hammock and folds their hands and says, what's the point of that? I'm watching you run around like a hamster on a wheel. Are you out of your mind? A whole generation came up in the 60s, from what I understand, which of course was before my time. A whole generation came up and saw their parents and looked at what was going on. And they said, what in the world are you people doing? Let's just be free. Let's drop all of this stuff. Why are you trying to do all of this? And they began to swing the pendulum the other way. The fool folds his hands, and eats his own flesh. There's a picturesque idea. Wow, this is the person who's so lazy that they refuse to do anything now. And they're saying, well, if it's not every man for himself, then what's the point? I'm not doing anything. Well, you're going to sit there until what? Till you all the beans in your cupboard are gone? Now what? Eat your fingernails? Now what? Now you have to sell your hammock so you can buy some more beans? Now what? Now you've got to sell the trees that were holding up your hammock so you can buy some more beans, and eventually you've run out of everything to sell, and all you've got is your own arm. That's kind of the picture here. A little bit exaggerated, a little bit poetic, but that's what it is. The fool folds his hands. What's the point? This is often the actual combination that we see from generation to the next. This is the teenager who slams the door and gets on the bed and puts on his headphones and listens to his loud music, and he doesn't want anything to do. And his father says to him, "Why won't you work?" "Why won't you work?" "Because I've seen you, Dad. I've seen you clamoring to get to the top. I've seen how it's destroyed our family. I've seen how it's destroyed my mother. I've seen what you've done. I've seen what this has turned you into. I've seen the monster that you are, and you're getting nowhere, and it's all for nothing, and there's no point, so I'm just dropping out." And the next generation comes along and swings the other way, and it's back and forth and back and forth. It's life under the sun. It's a rat race. It's clamoring. It's trying to be number one. What does he say in verse 6? "Better is one handful of quietness than two big, fat, greedy hands full of toil and striving after the wind." Contentment. Contentment. There's a clear lesson for every one of us in this. Let me ask you something very plainly. Have you been caught in the rat race of the world that we live in? Become a rat when you're in a rat race. Do you recognize that there is a person who will satisfy you beyond all else that this world offers you? Do you know that there is no person, there is no thing that will ultimately satisfy you? Do you know that incessant itch that you feel in your spirit, always looking for that next thrill, that next joy, that next something? Do you know that what you're looking for is a person, and his name is Christ? And he came and provided the human race with everything we would need. And what do we do as human beings? We ignore what God has given to us, and we somehow fall into the race of believing that I need to clamor. I need to be number one. I need to make a name for myself. And it means nothing. It is a striving after win. Observation number 3. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person, just an example now of someone who's so clamoring after the rat race to get to the top, so struggling to be number one, that he has no other. Is that because his wife has divorced him? You can fill in the blanks. He has neither son nor brother. Is that because they've ostracized him? Or is that just because his whole life is so consumed with getting there, with being number one? You can fill in the blanks. It's not clear in the text, and it really doesn't matter, but this man is alone. And as the picture is, he's sitting in his palatial place beside his pool with his one little cup of coffee that he had to fix himself. And he's reading his one little newspaper to see how his stocks are doing and how his business is flowing. And he's living and banging around in this place all by himself, yet there is no end to all his toil. His eyes are never satisfied with riches. Just one more deal, just one more million, just one more thing, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also was vanity and an unhappy business. Jesus had a phrase for this. It was the deceitfulness of riches. Riches trick you. They trick you into thinking they're important, and they trick you into thinking that it makes you important. And somehow you're deluded into thinking that if I have this thing, that somehow I've arrived. I don't know if this means anything to you, but it often makes me think back to my foolish days of pinball. I spent too much time doing this in my youth. It was just a quarter, and it was just a lot of fun. And it was always the game to try and be number one. If you didn't get into pinball, my apologies for giving a poor example that means nothing to you. It's not a lot of skill to it, and yet on some level, there's an enormous amount of skill to it, and you would not believe that You're only laughing because you never played pinball. You know, it's amazing how much, I never did this, truly. I didn't really care that much, but there would be people, you would walk in and you would know when you came into the place, don't touch that guy. He would have his bag of money, his quarters, on the machine beside his machine. Well, like more money than I'd seen in quarters in my lifetime as a teenager. And you could just tell by his stance and his whole position, this guy was going for the high score. Leave him alone. So you would gather around at a distance and it was just entertaining. Silence. And he would just work and work that machine and he could keep a ball going for the longest. You'd be amazed. And I mean, you'd be done in no time, but he just knew what to keep the bounce and it was, there's more skill than you believe. It's true. And then what would happen is, the thing would go nuts. Bing, bing, flash, flash, woo, woo, you know, da, 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 you got a high score. Well, can I just say, big deal? You know what you get to do? You get to type in, back in those days, you get to type in your initials. Not your name, your initials. So nobody even really knows who you are. And everybody now gets to the machine and they look at the machine and they go, oh, look, RPU got the high. Who's that? I have no idea. So you don't even get any glory. You get no fame. You are the only person who knows that you made it to the top for something that doesn't even matter. That to me is exactly the heart of man, as we see it as described in the book of Ecclesiastes. We are clamoring, vying for position, trying to get to something that doesn't even matter, that nobody even cares if you get there. The only person that matters, the only person that cares is you, and you don't even realize that the thing that you're chasing is vanity, is emptiness. That's why he says, this famous text, two are better than one because they have good reward for their toil. It's better to at least be doing something together. If they fall, one will lift his fellow up. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. That is just an obvious statement. If temperatures drop at night, just a kind of poetic, picturesque way to express that. That's obviously a saying, but there's meaning behind the saying. If you want to have success, you want to do best, do it. Don't do it alone. And yet, so often, that is the case. And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. If you don't know what it is to lie down and keep warm, it's just because you don't have someone who's going through menopause. I saw that recently and thought that was... So he has another illustration to finish this text off. He has an illustration that kind of brings things to a conclusion for people who are beginning to think, yeah, but you don't get it. Having money and having wealth, like, that's cool. I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, I'm enjoying myself getting there. I'm enjoying the things that it gives me. Don't misunderstand. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy. It's the attitude of the whole thing that this is about. It's the clamoring and the vying. It's the submission that God takes in the midst of all this. That our positioning means more to us. He has this illustration. For those who are thinking, well, being rich, I mean, that's a good thing. Striking it rich. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. Whether this was an actual event or this is just an illustration, he tells this little story. Sure, I'll give you that. It's better to be a wise and poor youth than an old and foolish king who didn't know how to take any advice. You know, the king is wealthy. He's at the top of the political power. But maybe his mind is starting to go. He's getting a little old and a little his bones are starting to creak, whatever the case. Doesn't know how to take advice. So they need another king. They find a poor and wise youth. He went from prison to the throne. Though in his own kingdom he'd been poor. So this is a rags to riches story. Who doesn't love that? One day, you don't have anything, you stumble over a suitcase, you open it up, it's got $1 million in it, your whole life changes. I happen to know of a situation where a young girl, sort of a connected, we don't need the details, she went to New York City to try out, make some music, make a demo. She didn't really know anybody. She hired a guy just to record her. While she was recording, somebody passed through the studio and listened to her singing. The next day, she was on the radio. And within a month, she was world famous. Rags to riches. Literally. Overnight. That's the story. Who is upset with a story like that? He went from prison to the throne to his own kingdom. He'd been poor. I saw all the living who move under the sun along with the youth that was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people. This was a great kingdom that he was going to oversee. This was an enormous position that he'd come into. This was the top of the top of the top. He was at the bottom. He went all the way to the top. There was no end to all the people of all whom he led. Yet those who came later will not rejoice in him. Who are you again? Oh yeah, you're the guy we hired a while back. Well, sorry, but someone better came along. And guess what? You're yesterday's news. And those songs that you put on the radio that used to be #1, we don't care about those anymore. There's a new #1. Oh yeah, what? Who are you? Oh yeah, that's right. It doesn't matter to me anymore. I don't care. And suddenly you realize that all that you clamored for and all that you worked for is only important to who? Nobody, nobody, nobody. Those who came later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is a vanity and a striving after wind. Strange little text in some ways, this Ecclesiastes 4, but let's get practical for a few minutes. What is this text telling us? Well, I've already hinted at it, I've already told you this, that our hearts are wired to clamor. Our hearts are hungry for satisfaction. Our minds are looking for peace and meaning. And we gravitate and somehow believe that somehow if we clamor and vie for position, that we'll find ourselves in a position that makes us feel better and look better. The human heart is always looking for somebody to satisfy us, for something to satisfy us. Can I just remind you, church, that we are not a people that get caught in a rat race. We have another kingdom that we live for, that we work for, that we die for. That we have a king whom we submit to, that all of our possessions belong to, that we are accountable to for our lives and for all that we do. And we are not in the position of using our resources in our lives for ourselves. We are not in the position of trying to clamber up the ladder for ourselves. We are not doing this so that we can look like we've achieved, somehow arrived at some place. Jesus, sounds so cliche, is the only one who satisfies the human soul. Jesus is the only one who provides for what we're actually looking for and the satisfaction that the human heart needs. If you don't know him, you will never be satisfied until you find him. If you don't know him, you will never know peace until you find him. He is all that we need in life under the sun. Can we pray? Father, even in the simplicity of this text this morning, we just ask that you would use this word to shape our lives, to remind us of who we need to be in Christ and to put him first in all things. Help us, Father, to order our lives accordingly, and we submit to you in Jesus' name. Amen.